Cool. Morning, everybody. That was, yeah, thanks for the intro. I'm not going to reiterate that, but um, most of the folks in this room I know, but the Salmonid life cycle monitoring project has over the last 30 years, since the early 90s, has been doing annual, estimates of juvenile outmigrants in the Grand Ronde or Upper Grand Ronde, Catherine Creek, Minam, and Lostine rivers. Um, and I wanted to take the opportunity to just look back at where we're at, or try to understand where we're at, how we got here, what trends or changes in fish production have occurred over that time. So, with that, a couple disclaimers here. Um, there was a lot of analysis and working with data that went into what I'm going to be showing. So I just want to point out that this is just a start of a discussion, and there's a lot more directions this can be taken, a lot more ways we can look at this information. So these results are preliminary, subject to change and refinement. And yeah, just serving as a conversation starter. Um, I as I was working through this, admittedly, it was a bit sobering at times, and I was it was tough to kind of see some of the outputs that I was looking at. But I just want to point out that these are just what the data suggests, and this is where we're at. This None of this is to suggest that what we're doing isn't working. It's just to kind of give everybody a look at where we are. So with that thinking, next steps, how can we apply this information to, say, incorporation within the life cycle model, let's say, or are there additional data sets that we might be able to use to refine this evaluation? Well, for better or worse, it's 2025. Um, and as Phil pointed out yesterday during his presentation, that um, the Grande Ronde Basin really has kind of been, an intensively monitored watershed, um, but not labeled as one. And there's been a tremendous amount of data collection efforts that's been done by state, federal, tribal NGOs over that time period. And along with that, there has been tens of millions, and I probably wouldn't be surprised if that number was actually in the hundreds of millions of dollars that has been spent through, yeah, federal, tribal, or excuse me, federal, state, tribal funds, whatever, that has gone into habitat restoration, primarily in the name of, helping to support and work towards broad sense recovery for spring Chinook salmon and summer steelhead. But a lot of that is, process based work too. So I mean, watershed health is absolutely important. Um, Over that time period, as I mentioned, from the early 90s, at least the juvenile monitoring aspect has been in operation. Alongside that has been the Lower Snake River Compensation Plan, which has been doing decades of spawning ground surveys and estimates of returning adults, and weir management, and the ability to evaluate productivity is reliant on both of those data sets being present and being robust. Um, so we've reached a point where we can start to look at a reasonably long-term data set, uh, and try to get an understanding of how productivity for spring Chinook salmon has changed over time. I have the word productivity underlined here. I'm going to be using that word a lot. I'm going to define it here in a second, but just kind of keep an eye out for it. Um, so for this evaluation, I asked two pretty broad questions. Question one was, has productivity changed over time? We have data starting in the mid 90s, until now for both juvenile and adult, and wanted to see whether we're seeing a response, seeing a change, seeing a trend, whatever. The second question is, with the atlas being pretty heavily influenced by the thinking that summer rearing conditions are really important and should be focused on for restoration efforts. I wanted to take a look at whether summer base flow conditions have A, changed, and B, does it have any influence on salmon productivity? uh, I suppose there are quite a few folks in the room who know David Noakes. He was a mentor of mine. Um, and one of the things that a friend of mine just recently reminded me of, he says, "Joe, when you do a presentation, you need to start out with telling people what you found. Then you show them how you found it, and then you need to tell them again what you found." So I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'm going to kind of come out and just say high level what some of the observations were for this evaluation. Um, for Catherine Creek, what I saw was some pretty strong evidence of decline in productivity over the last 25, 30 years. Um, this decline appears to be related to intrinsic productivity, which I'll define again here in a minute. Flow appears to be moderately linked to productivity, primarily in the habitat capacity realm. And at least from the gauge data that I was using, it looks as though there might be actually some good news here, and that base flow conditions may be improving. We'll see. For upper Grande Ronde, interestingly, and I have some thoughts on this, but little to no evidence of change in productivity over that time. Flow is pretty strongly related to productivity, um, in that August mean discharge appears to be on a slight decline over this time period. Minum, moderate evidence of decline in productivity over time. Minum serves kind of as our reference or control watershed within the basin to compare our supplemented populations with. But it too is showing some potential signs of a decline in productivity. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. No apparent link between flow and productivity, no apparent trend in August base flow conditions. And I think the Lostine was the really tough one for me to take a look at, because there's very strong evidence that productivity has declined over the last 30 years in the Lostine. Um, it appears to be due to intrinsic productivity. Again, I'll define this in a second. Um, Flow appears to be really strongly linked to productivity. And right now, or at least as far as I can or as far as the data suggest, no evidence that the decline is related to flow. Um, all right, so I'm gonna jump to the part of like, how did I do this? How did I come to the findings that I found? So I used a Bayesian Ricker model approach. I'm not going to dive into what Bayesian modeling is, but the long and short of it is it's just a good approach that it's a parameter estimation approach that uses data as well as prior information, and provides you with a level of sort of confidence in what that value of those parameters are. I'll talk more about the parameters. Ricker models, I will dive into just so that folks can kind of or folks can follow along and interpret as I'm going through this. But a Ricker is just a stock recruit model. So your stock, or at least for this evaluation, the stock is the total spawner abundance. Recruit is the total number of juveniles leaving the tributary. And I think I just want to point out here that that was my recruit metric, because that is the most solid metric we have for understanding headwater juvenile rearing habitat productivity. The further you go down in the basin, you have to start factoring in, out of watershed or out of rearing habitat effects. So the recruit portion of this evaluation was total juveniles leaving the tributary. And that's at our screw traps. Sorry. So like for each of the screw traps, that is the delineation point for the data being used here. So recruit per stock or recruit per spawner is equivalent to productivity. Crash course here in Ricker models. Again, I'm doing this because I'm going to be showing a lot of plots. I'm going to be, I'm going to be using the words alpha and beta as little as possible. I'm going to try to use the words intrinsic productivity and habitat capacity as much as possible. But this is the most basic form of a Ricker model. Basically what it says is that the recruits, or the log of recruits per spawner, can be explained by the intrinsic productivity of that population minus the density dependence effects, which is determined by the number of spawners within the system. So the alpha portion of this equation is basically what is the effect of changing intrinsic productivity. So if we sorry, I'll get to that in a second. And beta is in this model is the effect of changing habitat capacity. So that's kind of the one that this group is primarily interested in. So in other words, productivity is equal to intrinsic productivity minus habitat capacity modulated by number of spawners. Um, these are some examples of some Ricker plots. These aren't real data. These are just simulated data. But just to kind of show how changes in those intrinsic productivity and habitat capacity components of the model change your outputs. And so on the left, we have this changing intrinsic productivity. So what that means is like, how high does that peak go? Where do you hit, um, absent of habitat capacity limitations, how many juveniles are the adults able to produce per spawner? Um, on the right side, we have this beta, or the effective habitat capacity. This is at what point does the population start to experience density dependence effects? So if we have a change in alpha over time, that would mean that the intrinsic productivity, the fish themselves are potentially producing fewer juveniles or fewer outmigrants, let's say, per adult. If we have a change in this habitat capacity, that would mean that the density dependence within that system is changing, better or worse. It just depends on what the data tell you. Um, for this evaluation, I'm sure there are lots of folks in this room that understand the phrase stepwise process. But I used basically a stepwise modeling process where I took the null model, which is just the most basic form of it, and initially evaluated the data through a direct effect model, which is basically saying like, not looking at alpha, not looking at beta, does time and does flow explain variations in productivity? Um, so if that model if that popped out as saying like, yes, productivity is changing over time, or it appears that flow has a non-zero influence on productivity, then I went kind of this next level, which is a parameter linked model. And I said, okay, does time or flow affect alpha or beta, or this intrinsic productivity or habitat capacity? Just to kind of get a sense of like, okay, well, we're seeing a change. Is that change related to this alpha, or is it related to this beta? Um, so in a nutshell, what we want to know is if that effect term, so you see the word effect there, um, if that is non-zero and if it's truly non-zero. Um, so interpretations of these results, um, I'm going to be talking about the direct effect model, as well as alpha and beta effects. For the direct effect model, if the effect term is definitively non-zero, then fluctuations in productivity as a whole can be explained by that effect, or time or flow. For the parameter linked models, these are sort of the more nuanced, like digging a little deeper. If the effect term is non-zero on the alpha, or the intrinsic productivity portion of the model, then fluctuations in intrinsic productivity can be explained by fluctuations in that effect. And the same for beta. If that's non-zero, then beta is being affected by whatever covariate you plug in there. All right, so we'll jump into. I'm going to work. I'm going to work in sort of a least interesting to most interesting approach here. Um, Starting with the minimum. So I'm going to go through a series of plots here. There's going to be this slide that has the Ricker plots. There's going to be the next set of slides is just going to be sort of the raw data looking at potential trends, and like, does the outputs of the Ricker estimation, the Ricker model parameter estimation, match with what we're kind of seeing in potential trends in the data? So on the left-hand side, these are all the this is looking at the effect of time, or is productivity changing over time? And when we're looking at these Ricker plots, this is a good example because the plot on the left, you can see that those lines are pretty distinctly separated from one another. Um, on the right, you can see they're basically right on top of one another. So the way to interpret, or just broadly interpret that, is that, okay, there appears to be something going on if those lines really start to separate from one another. So for the minimum, over time, there appears to be a rather moderate decline in productivity. And in regards to with and so in the bottom there, where it says time alpha, time beta, no effect detected, meaning when I looked into this at the At the parameter linked level, nothing came out. So I'll get to why that might be. And in relation to flow, um, those lines being stacked right on top of one another, flow explains none of the variability in productivity, and thus there's no alpha or beta effect. So here's the trends. On the left, we have log recruits per spawner, or our productivity metric across time. So starting back in, what was that, maybe 98 to present, there appears to be a slight decline in productivity over that time, or moderate decline in productivity over that time. But those data points are kind of sporadic around that line. There may be some sort of oscillation or some sort of lag period effect that's going on here. But overall, across the whole, it seems as though there's a slight decline. Um, and as with the same goes for the Ricker plots for flow. Like, there's just no trend whatsoever um, in mean. Oh, I didn't. Yeah, sorry. I meant to mention that. So for the flow aspect, I used mean August stream flow as it's the sort of best indicator of what summer rearing conditions look like. So sorry, I should be looking at my notes here. I spent all this time doing this. But the flow plots that you're going to be looking at, they're all z-scored. So that's just a way of sort of like, it's not exactly centering the data, but it sort of puts them on the same playing field because it's a nonlinear distribution. It kind of tightens them up. And so what you're looking at is these values are actually like number of standard deviations from mean. So it's not like -1 CFS or +1 CFS. It's actually a standard deviation from the mean of the entirety of the data points. Okay, moving on to slightly more interesting. Upper Grande Ronde is, again, the data suggests that there's really no reasonable detectable change in productivity over time for the Upper Grande Ronde population, and thus no change in intrinsic productivity or habitat capacity. But there was a pretty strong effect of summer base flow conditions on productivity. So as summer base flow conditions increase, so does productivity, which makes sense. And it also makes sense that, if there was a strong positive effect of flow on productivity, that we would kind of see that precipitate out through this habitat capacity component of the model. So fish like water, who knew? And here's those trend plots. Yeah, on the left, no real trend that you can pull from that. Data are kind of all over the place. But yeah, the flow trend plot, yeah, it does show sort of a loosely declining trend. And I back calculated this out to approximately 1.7 CFS per decade. So a lot of scatter around that line, but overall it seems like at the Woodley gauge, by the way, this for Upper Grande Ronde, it was the Woodley gauge data that I used. It looks like there might be a slight decline over time. And I think this maybe matched up a little bit with what Tyler was talking about yesterday. So I don't know, maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. Or I totally wrong here. Moving on to Catherine Creek. We can see on both sides of or both plots that those lines are pretty well separated from one another. So over time, there does appear to be a strong effect or effect of time, or over time, productivity does appear to be declining, and as well as the effect of flow. I mean, yeah, again, in the habitat capacity portion of the model, if you increase flow, you increase habitat capacity, and you see a strong effect of productivity as a result of that. Trend plots support this. These findings. It does appear that Catherine Creek is Sorry. Regarding the time series, it supports the notion that over time productivity has changed. Again, back calculated this out. Um, it's reduced by about 77 recruits per spawner over 29 years, which equates to about 50%. Um, which is, yeah. Anyway, flow. This is like the one sort of maybe hopeful bright spot I found in all of this it appears that in Catherine Creek, at least at the gauge where I had gauge data available, is showing a reasonably positive trend over time in the August mean flows, and maybe that's a result of a lot of the water transaction work and protecting water in stream that's we're kind of seeing here in the data. I don't know. This one was kind of came out of left field, and I want to hear others' thoughts on this. But all right, the Lostine. Um, this one was when I didn't want to believe this one when it came up. I just saw that like crazy separation on the left hand side. This just drastic separation in those lines, and I ran it again and again and again, and it came out again and again and again. I was like, where do I have this messed up? And it's there's a very strong declining trend over time for Lostine, the Lostine Chinook salmon population. And in this circumstance, the intrinsic productivity aspect of the Ricker model showed a pretty strong negative. Over time, the intrinsic productivity element of that model came out as being very non-zero and negative, meaning the population's intrinsic productivity, given what the data say, suggests that has been declining over time. The on the right, the sort of the same story as the other ones. Fish like water, but interestingly, the habitat capacity component to this did not come out as having any sort of strong effect. It was actually on the intrinsic productivity portion of the model where it came out to be definitively non-zero. So that was a bit of a head scratcher, but I suppose this room could hypothesize some reasons for that. And yeah, again, the trend plots, kind of just corroborating the observations. The left time series plot, pretty definitive declining trend in productivity. About 88 recruits per spawner over 27 years, which comes out to something like 65 or 70%, I think, of what it was 27 years ago. Excuse me, 30 or 40% of what it was 27 years ago. And no indication that flow is doing much of anything important here. So, going to circle back to this, David's wisdom. Going to reiterate kind of what I observed with this was so in Catherine Creek, strong evidence of decline in productivity over time. Flow moderately linked to that productivity, and that that came through in the habitat capacity component, which makes sense. Potential improvements in summer-based flows, maybe. I'd like to look into that one more. Upper Grande Ronde, little to no change in productivity over time. Flow was strongly linked to productivity. Again, makes sense. And August mean discharge up at the Woodley gauge appears to be on a slight decline over the last, over the time period. Minum, moderate evidence of decline in productivity, no link to flow, no change in in August base flow conditions at the gauge. And then Lostine, a very strong evidence. There's very strong evidence of decline in productivity in that population over this time frame. Decline appears to be due to changes in that intrinsic productivity, the population's ability to produce juveniles, not the habitat's ability to accommodate them. and no evidence of trend in flow. So I have some parting considerations here. Maybe just some initial thoughts on why this might be, and then so for Catherine Creek, it was a bit conflicting that the data suggested that there was a slight increase in base flow conditions, but that did not come through in in a subsequent sort of increase in productivity. Um, so a bit conflicting, but interesting. Um, so it sort of begs this question of like, well, what is that decline potentially due to? And I maybe have some questions about how does management of adults at the weir affect our population's ability to rebound from or head back towards recovery. Um, Upper Grand Ronde, we know Upper Grand Ronde is habitat limited, it's pool limited, it's flow limited, it's got the whole rap sheet. Um, but it appears that flow may be making it more limited, which is not a great sign. But um, yeah, um, the no change in spawner abundance for Upper Grand Ronde was surprising, just because of how much that population has struggled. But in a way, it sort of makes sense because the Grand Ronde population has like maybe twice in the last 25, 30 years had more than 300 or 400 spawners or something. I mean, it's just critically low numbers. So you're never really going to hit that, these levels of where density dependence kicks in, or you start to see this decline in just population productivity just because there's so few adults. Um, what about, and the role of pre-spawn mortality? I mean, is that small spawner abundance population getting even smaller, and detecting a change in productivity of 50 successful spawners is nearly impossible. Um, Minum, moderate evidence of decline. Is this potentially due to out of basin effects? Seems like a reasonable thought to start with. And just a broader question is, is the Minum still serving as a good control or reference for our supplementation evaluation programs? So, just something to throw out there. And Lostine, strong decline in productivity, no change in flow, yet productivity linked to flow. But that sort of makes sense, because if the flow is not improving and it's strongly linked to flow, then we probably wouldn't see that subsequent population effect. Um, I, I'm really scratching my head on the Lostine and what gives. I mean, why such strong evidence of this decline over this time period? And um, I, I was chatted with Kyle about this a lot, and one thing and I brought it up at some of the IT meetings, and one of the things that's sort of stuck in my craw about a lot of the conversations that we're having is I feel like there are two groups of folks that are sitting in separate rooms, making decisions, deciding where to do restoration work, deciding how many fish to be putting above the weir, of what type, of whatnot. And the conversations between those groups is really important. Our success as habitat restoration practitioners in the basin is essentially linked to how adults are managed at the weir, and how we choose which fish go upstream and spawn. And likewise, their success as a supplementation program that's aimed towards recovery is dependent upon how well we're able to improve the habitat and improve the capacity of these areas. So I guess that's just sort of my overarching parting thought. Was I would love to start getting those two groups of folks to talk a little bit more with one another and become a little bit more involved with one another's discussions and thoughts. So anyhow, some acknowledgments. Obviously, funders, Bonneville Power Administration. Lower Snake River Compensation Plan. This wouldn't be available without their funding, and the data wouldn't be there. I'd like to thank Megan Sable and Adam Storch with ODFW. They're two of our analysts. They're incredibly bright and really kind of help walk me through this. Ian Tatum and Casey Bleesner really helped with the conceptualization of this and understanding and discussions about how we can sort of move this forward. And of course, all of the life cycle monitoring staff, present and past. It's an immense amount of data, and it's a hell of a lot of work to collect it. So massive appreciation there, and support and contributions from all of our partners too, helping out spawning ground surveys, helping out with all of the tagging and fish collections and whatnot. It's pretty cool. We got a really good partnership here. So yeah.
Thanks, Joe. I was just wondering, have you looked at temperature in addition to flow? See if does temperature basically mirror flow or not?
I mean, it does, right? I mean, we know that flow affects temperatures, but the temperature data sets are there's a lot of temperature data. There are a few data sets that are as long as these data sets that I'm working with, and consistent as well as in the same location. And so I'm looking into it, but it's tricky. They're like you got to get lucky with some of these. Like there might be some where we just don't have the temperature data to look at that, but temperature data is so important and like would be an awesome addition to this. So
Yeah, one reason for my question is that a lot of the projections of climate change effects, like Dan Isaac's work, is based on assumptions about increasing temperatures, and so it would, and we've talked about, the need to incorporate climate change into our restoration planning. So, uh, kind of a critical question.
it is. Yeah. Dr. White.
Thanks, Joe, for the clear but sobering presentation. My question was kind of similar to the last, and I was just wondering, like, if you've thought about like throwing more variables at this just to see whether maybe alternative flow metrics like winter flow, like in the Upper Grand Ronde, we had seen like loss of productivity with like really high spate events in the winter that might be like scouring out reds and things like that. And do you envision taking your analysis and kind of throwing more variables at it in an AIC like fashion? And then I just had one comment on the lost steam is that I'm not as baffled by that result, I think, because even though you see a declining trend in flow, no declining trend in flow over time, but the habitat capacity was tightly linked to productivity. That's just Isn't that just explained by the variability, the year-to-year variability in flow, even though you don't have a long-term decadal trend? And that kind of begs the question, with climate change, we're expecting to see more variability in conditions and not just changes in the mean values. So maybe looking at the variability of some of these metrics over time and that trend might be as interesting as looking at the mean. Sorry, I know that was a lot.
No, I think at a broad set, yeah, like I said from the beginning, like this is just the start. And I'd love to hear if folks have additional thoughts or input as far as like different data or different ways of looking at this. This is just sort of the pretty high level, like this is the most basic Toyota Corolla of where we can go with this. So I'm gonna maybe slap some rims on it and whistle tip or something. But yeah, yes. The answer is yes, and that's the next steps is this whole model selection, model averaging, add additional variables, look at flow different. Yes.
Thanks, Joe. So looking at the recruits piece, was that screw trap data?
Yes.
And so is that like your abundance estimate at your screw trap, that kind of thing? So from experience running a screw trap and doing those estimates, like there's a lot of variability and unexplained error in those. So like maybe digging more into that, because that could be, just from basin to basin and year to year and how those screw traps are run. And there's a lot that goes into that gets tied up in that abundance piece. And so kind of digging into that and like maybe trying to quantify that a little bit better. I don't
Yeah.
know. And then, feeding that back into your model
I
and
yeah,
could have a big impact on what you're seeing in your
100%.
so.
I appreciate that. And I have there's a lot of stuff that I looked into in excess of what I'm presenting here. And like I even have some plots where I have the error bars around the estimate. Um, and even so, like the lost gene in particular, like even with like that strong of a decline, like even incorporating that error and looking at it, it's still present. But point well taken. And yeah, absolutely. That's, I mean, before, yeah, taking this much further, that needs to be more out front and acknowledged. But yeah,
Hey, Joe. Maybe an ignorant question. You said you want the hatchery and habitat folks to talk more. What do you want them to talk about?
I think getting them in the same room would be a good start. Um, that's, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of where I left off, right? I just, um, it's, to me, it seems inappropriate to be trying to evaluate the effectiveness of habitat restoration when you have an entirely different group of people making decisions that directly influence how you are trying to evaluate this. Um, like, maybe let's start with like origin, PHOS. Like that's a pretty good conversation to be had. Like if there's reason to believe that hatchery fish are less productive than natural origin fish, if we're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of habitat restoration and we're putting a bunch of hatchery fish up there that were just on their own less productive, it's something we should be factoring in, right? So it it's yeah, it's sort of an open-ended comment that I don't know where to go with it.
Thanks for this. It was hard to listen to. You've talked about Chinook, this whole everything. I'm curious about Steelhead, if you had data on that, or if you can make any inferences in the productivity in the basins, in regards to Steelhead.
We do have steelhead data. It's much messier and a lot more assumptions that need to be made in doing that type of. I've not gone that route. I think we should. I mean, we can't ignore steelhead. I personally don't believe we should be ignoring steelhead. Um, but just given the life history flexibility with steelhead, it's hard to make inference and follow this same type of approach, especially when spawning ground surveys have for the last umpteen years been non-existent or very few to even try to have that stock portion of the stock recruit model. So that's not a great answer. I'd love to. I don't know that we can.
I forgot the next question. It'll be like on the slide with the Lostine where you see the intrinsic production declining. I'd have to think more exactly how you did all the stats, but how does that take into account density dependent effects? Because it seems like some of those lower years were like years of like higher spawner abundance. So like in the early 2010s, is that graph actually just showing us that the Lostine is like more directly affected by density dependence than the other groups?
That's a good point. And again, I looked at a lot of stuff in preparation for this, and I just kind of wanted to keep it to the core stuff. With the Lostine in particular, um, maybe if I distill your question down as like, is there reason to believe that maybe a change in number of spawners is having that effect over time? And like, has the number of spawners increased over that time period? Not, no. Or like the variability within that, it would not account for that drastic of a change. But yeah,
Like, did you ever just put like a simple bar graph of like spawners above the weir against this and see like how it looked?
yeah, I have a bunch of rigger plots that have the years pasted on there with the number of spawners and the number of out migrants, and they're just super busy, and nobody in here would be able to see them. So those plots tell this tell a much more detailed story that I think gets at your question. And I chose to not put them in here just because they were really busy, and these can already be busy enough. So um,
Yeah, I just have a quick question. On those graphs you have of brood year and productivity, there's a consistent pattern, I think, amongst all four of the rivers that you're looking at, where around 2010 and a little bit on, you've got these really low productivity values. And it's almost, the pattern of the graph is almost like a J, where you have really high productivity early on. It kind of crashes down, but it actually looks like it's sort of recovering in the last few years. So I was just curious if you knew what was causing that low productivity during that span of years from 2010 to about 2015, I think.
and it was crazy number of spawners, like thousands of spawners in all. Yeah, and that's where you hit this the density dependence effect really kicks in there. I mean, and they're like wild outliers. Like, the Lostine, it was something like averaging between 300 and 700 adults across the time frame. And what was it in 2010? 3,000? It was some ridiculous number. It was so those years in particular were the years where really high spawner numbers and just density dependence was really high.
Yeah, just a clarifying question about the flow data on the Lostine and Catherine Creek. Which gauges were you using for data? The uppermost on both, like above all diversions?
Lostine, I think was the gauge that I used, and I don't know that I need to go back and look at that. I purposely use the highest up one to try to account for or minimize withdrawals, which I know Catherine Creek, that one's questionable
Okay.
at the time. But I used the highest up gauge that had the data.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.